Hi there, welcome to the archives. So today I thought I would get started on a book I've had for a really, really long time. I think this was originally my mom's book. Yeah, this is grade six. So this is for a sixth grade reading level. It was one of the books we read at school um, from Scholastic. Uh, we're gonna get started on Sojourner Truth in I Am Woman. I'm just gonna do the introduction chapter this time. So it's written by Patricia C. Um, McKissick, McKizak and Frederick McKizak. That's how you say it. And so basically, it says that. So, 1 second. But at the back of the book, there's a whole bunch of other more people to know about, or people who Sojourner Truth knew about. So there's Richard Allen. I'm going to get into all of these. Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, John Jay, David Ruggles, Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a really important person in the case. Elizabeth Stanton. So I'm maybe we'll come back later. Harriet Tubman. But basically, this one, I'm not gonna directly get into her, even though I do. I want to share more the history of what it looked like at that time. Okay? So specifically, we're gonna be looking at New York. What was New York like in the 17th century, which is 1600s? So basically, this is an image of Sojourner Truth. Again, as I get into the other chapters, we'll get more into her. But the introduction, basically, she was born Isabella Van Wagener. She was born enslaved, and she was enslaved for the first 28 years of her life. And then she lived as a free woman. So when she became free, she's changed her name to Sojourner Truth. And in 1850, so again, this is now that will be technically the 19th century. Always remember how you hear it is a year behind, 100 years behind. So when you hear, like for instance, right now we're in 2026, right? The 20s, but we're technically in the 21st century. So when you hear 21st century, that makes you think, okay, 100 years before, which is 20. When we were in the 19th centuries, that means it was the 1800s, right? When we hear 20th centuries, we're talking 1900. So in 1850, she published an autobiography called The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave. I have not read that yet. Um, so she herself published her autobiography, and it details her life, her story, basically, right? And she was born sometime in 1797. That's a very, very long time ago. 1797. That same year, John Adams became the second president of the United States. So, also that year, George Washington, who was the first president of the United States, he had warned in his farewell speech that the regional bickering would one day disrupt the Union, right? So she came into the world at this time where America was going through a transition. Um, her enslaved name was Isabella, but her mother and her father shortened it to Belle. And her parents were owned by Colonel Johannes Hardenbergh, and his family was one of the oldest and wealthiest landowners in the Ulster County, New York. So she was enslaved in the north, which is different from most. You usually hear folks who are enslaved being in the south. Sojourner was enslaved in the north, specifically in what is now New York. And so the Hardenberghs, who was the owners where they basically lived and worked and grew up, they owned at one time nearly 2 million acres between the Hudson and the Delaware Rivers. Again, remember, this is all native land, right? And so we're going to get into how they purchased the land. Um, so they had an old manor called Stone Ridge, which was built in 1672 by the Louis Hardenbergh, and they were basically the son of espoused patroon of Holland. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's like a royal family in Holland or something like that. But they definitely were like aristocratic, right? They had money. They came to the New World. They were Dutch settlers. So they came. Dutch is Amsterdam, so the Netherlands, right? Orange. They came from the Netherlands. The Dutch settlers settled here. Um, what they consider quote unquote the New World. They came in the beginning of 1624. So remember, the first boats or sets would have come in 1619, right? So 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. 5 years later, the Dutch had already arrived. So usually we hear about the French and the British. We don't tend to hear the Dutch settlers. We don't talk about the German settlers, right? They were also settling. The Portuguese we don't often talk about. It's usually French. Later it became French, and at least in Canada, the French and the British were the more dominant one. But much of New York was owned by folks from the Netherlands, Dutch settlers. Okay, so by 1626, the Dutch had bought Manhattan Island from the Canarsee Indians, the natives. Is that how you say it? Canarsee? Listen to this. For $24 worth of bangles and beads. I keep saying 19, by 1626, the Dutch had bought Manhattan Island from the Canarsee Indians for $24, not for 2,400, not 24 million, not 24,000. It says $24 worth of bangles and beads. And they immediately started building Fort New Amsterdam. And this was at the southernmost point of the island, which is now known as Manhattan. So basically, the Dutch bought Manhattan Island for $24, a smooth $24. And their descendants will dead ass look you in the face and be like, why can't you buy your own house? Oh, because your people bought the land, almost $2 million worth, 2 million acres worth of land for $24? Well, I don't know if that's how much acres, but this is just all it says here is Manhattan Island. So, and again, the language says is as if they bought it. No, I think they tricked them. You have to remember the indigenous folks at 1926 probably did not speak Dutch or English or French in a way to be able to sign a contract, a legal contract that was legally binding that says this is we're giving you away our land, right? I don't think that that's what actually happened. I don't think they knew that they were selling, giving, right, their land for $24. A lot of indigenous folks don't even believe in owning property like the land itself. They're caretakers of the land. And you hear folks from Greenland saying that right now. In Greenland, we cannot own land. The land is not ours to own, right? We are caretakers. We take care of the land. And so just pay attention to like how it makes it look like, oh, these native people just gave away all of their land for $24, knowing exactly what they were doing for the rest of their, like, that's not what happened. It was not consensual. Oftentimes it was stolen or unsurrendered. So basically, they started building Fort New Amsterdam, and that when they came, they brought 11 black indentured servants from the West Indies. So they were apparently already in the West Indies. You have to know that the Dutch were in the West Indies. Um, oh, what are some of the Dutch countries? I can't think of anything. Um, Saint Martin, is it Dutch or French? Where did, not Bermuda. I can't, my geography is not great right now. Not Bahamas. I can't think of it. But there are some islands that are the Dutch owned. And so they had brought with them 11 black African enslaved from the West Indies to build their fort. So again, when you hear a lot of white people being like, we built this land, it was enslaved labor. It was black enslaved labor oftentimes. They brought the black enslaved West Indians to build their forts, their literal forts, okay? At least according to this book. And they didn't finish building it until 1635. So those first blacks who survived the brutal winters, there was accidents, there was disease, backbreaking labor. The ones who survived, they earned their freedom, and they basically, it says that they were accepted members of the colony. Again, they probably were not accepted members because there was racism, right? So I think the language, this is again for sixth grade level, so they have to kind of soften the blow for the little kids, right? But like, I don't think that they were actually um, welcomed into the community. One second. Okay. So the enslaved built their forts for them, basically started building their own colonies. They didn't actually build the colonies themselves. It would have been an indentured slave or a servant that built it for them, right? So um, Dutch documents show that as early as 1643, a free black man named Comingo Anthony owned property in the area known today as Greenwich Village. At that same time, it was just basically a swamp, right? In 1647, a land was granted to John Negro, an indentured servant who came with the privateer. So some blacks lived free. They worked, they conducted business in New Amsterdam, but a larger population of black people were enslaved for life. And we went through this with one of the other books. Remember, it started with um, well, initially you can work for you're indebted to us for 9 years, 7 years, but then once they realized that because they had framed black people, the Africans, as like not human, then they started enslaving people for life. But that was not actually a thing. It's just a thing that they made up, right? Oh, yep, we can. You are mine. We can enslave you for life. Now it's not just 7 years. It's not 9 years, right? It's for life. And so that was the majority of the black people at that time in New York. And this was especially true when the colony came under England's rule, right? The English were particularly brutal. It said that the Germans were also particularly brutal. So were the French. I mean, it was just a brutal regimes in general, right? And so the English defeated the Dutch in 1664. They captured all of their holdings in the new, quote unquote, New World. So New Amsterdam was renamed New York, okay? And it became a flourishing slave market. So New York, folks will often look at the north of the United States as like this land of the free. Same with Canada, right? Land of the free. The Americans came here to escape slavery. We also had enslaved people, which is what we're going to get into. But yeah, basically New York became a flourishing slave market. Um, and slavery didn't even start in Georgia, the Georgia colony, until 1749, right? So again, this idea that like, of course, obviously the South had the antebellum South was really bad, but it's important to know that Georgia's slavery didn't start in Georgia until much later, right? Like 100 years later. And so basically, ships loaded with human cargo, they found a market in the New York harbors. And unlike the indentured servants of the past, these captive Africans were sold into a bitter life of forced labor with no hope for freedom. So by 1700, New York harbor was jammed with ships carrying cargo. It was so inhumane that some local white people were like, "This is not okay. This is not okay." Um, there was a slave market led in by a Bostonian judge, Samuel Sewall, who wrote The Selling of Joseph, and is the first anti-slavery essay written in the colonies. And so basically, there was so much slave uprisings. Again, when they act like black people didn't do anything and it was just the white people that saved them, that's not true. There were a lot of slave. It says there were so many slave uprisings in New York that it shows that like many black enslaved people opposed it. They fought against it, and the protests and the rebellions, it didn't stop the slave trade, but it didn't stop enslaved people from also rebelling. It didn't stop them from their uprisings, right? So by 1720, there were 4,000 slaves, enslaved people among the 31,000 colonists living in New York. So 31,000 settlers, white settlers, and about 4,000 enslaved black Africans, right? So that made it the one of the largest slaveholding states north of Maryland prior to the Revolutionary War. Most of these enslaved were owned by the Dutch descendants, like we said, and most of them, the Dutch people actually left the crowded Manhattan and they pushed 80 miles upstate to where they started quietly farming. Okay, so the largest state owners, like Southern planters, believed that slavery was an essential element in a prosperous economy, right? They didn't know how else to make money. If the labor was basically the labor is free, then we could jack the prices up. We don't have to pay any, we just cut all of that out. They lack creativity. Like there are other ways to make money. They just completely lack creativity. They're money driven, greedy, just insecure, right? And so basically, yeah, that was New York at the time. And then we have the New England Quakers started to be appalled by the system. So you had white people like, ew, what are we doing? Who have we become? A lot of them were New England Quakers. They pushed up against the status quo. The rich and powerful Dutch landowners did not like this, right? Including the Hardenberghs. They were very pro-slavery, and they just kept on delaying emancipation and delaying emancipation in New York and in New Jersey. But after the Revolutionary War, New York abolitionists attacked slavery on a national level, and they pushed for the end of it through the Constitution. We see the Constitution is attacked, and people are like, do you even have a Constitution anymore? But after the Revolutionary War, um, basically they used the Constitution to argue that slavery was wrong, right? Obviously, the Southerners pushed back. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, he actually opposed slavery, but he conceded, right? Just like we see companies conceding now. James Madison conceded, and he compromised on the slavery issue, basically to appease the South, right? And to secure approval for the document. So even after the constitutional government had been established, the pro and anti-slavery factions continued. The abolitionists pushed for an end of slavery, and they asked for that to be included in the Bill of Rights. And the newly elected congressman from South Carolina, he defended slavery on the grounds that it made the state, that it was a state and not a federal issue, right? So basically, he went on to say that like blacks are inherently inferior beings, and they would be harmed by freedom. So you see them spinning this lie. We were living our lives great. We had our wealth. We were right. We were minding our own business. Now they are saying that if we are free, as in the black Africans, then that's gonna harm them. Mental gymnastics, psychological warfare, manipulation. It's in their DNA, right? And so if these people aren't enslaved, if we don't run them, they are barbarics. They need us to enslave them. Like, no, we don't. No, we don't. Um, and so um, by in 1793, Eli Whitney basically patented the cotton gin, and the slavery question was a moot. So the gin made cotton the primary crop in the South, and it increased the demand for slave labor. People were still resisting in the North, though. It was like resistance to slavery was increasing. The South then countered its opposition by supporting the passage of the first fugitive slave law, which was enacted in Congress in February of 1793, right? And that made it criminal offense to harbor runaway slaves or prevent their arrest. Again, you see the same thing now. You cannot harbor an illegal immigrant or an alien or all of these terms that they have for folks who are basically undocumented, right? Same thing. You saw this with Nazi Germany as well too. You cannot harbor a Jew. So they find ways to kind of like find a loophole. But people kept on pushing, right? The Quakers kept on pushing, the black folks kept on resisting, the uprisings continued, and the Quakers increased their efforts, and it became a state issue. And then the struggle for emancipation in New York had begun as early as 1777. So when John Jay was tried to include an abolition clause in the New York State Constitution, it failed. But every year after John Jay continued, he submitted the bill um, to block pro-slavery legislatures, and they pushed back because they were owned by the landowners, and the struggle went on and on and on, right? So anti-slavery forces, they had their big victory in 1781 when New York recognized the contributions of black men who had made towards the Revolutionary War efforts, right? So those who fought for the Revolutionary Wars, they started to get some credit, and those who remained enslaved were automatically freed. And this is kind of the environment that Sojourner Truth was born into, right? So when she's born now in 1797, New York and New Jersey were the only northern states that still permitted slavery. And so during the first 2 years of her life, we see New York is really going through a lot of changes. New York passed a law that both groups could agree on, and in 1799, the state legislature voted to gradually free enslaved people that were born after July 4th of 1799, right? So that's Independence Day. Basically, that was women the age of 25 and men at the age of 28. And so this is the environment that folks like Sojourner Truth are going to be born into. So we're going to move into the first chapter, and I'm going to continue with her life. It'll go more into like the Hardenberghs and what the Dutch were like. Right? They spoke Dutch at home, so she grew up learning Dutch at home. We're going to get into all of that. But New York was a large slave market at one point. It was majority owned before the British one. It was owned by a lot of the Dutch folks. Dutch people are from the Netherlands. The Netherlands, their capital city is Amsterdam, and that's what the original forts in New York that were built. They were known as Fort New Amsterdam. And so we're going to continue to move into Sojourner Truth's story. Before I do that, in the next couple I want to go back to what was it, what happened before that? Like, how did the enslaved Africans even get there? So, in some of the next ones, we're going to go back before into the Ndongo Kingdom. So we'll learn about some of them, what the Africans were doing, and who were some of the players that worked with the white Europeans to create this disaster that we know was the enslavement of Black Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. So, yeah, this is basically an introduction of New York at the time and what the climate was that Sojourner Truth was growing up in. Okay, so I'll end it here for today, and I think we're going to move backwards before we move forward again, so we can get an understanding of how did we get here. Okay, so again, this is mostly the history lesson. Like I said, this year I'm mostly going to be sharing social science and humanities themes. So that's history, geography, sociology, anthropology, um, gender studies, feminist studies, all of these kind of race, ethnicity, social inequality. Okay, so that'll be my approach that I'm taking, focusing with a heavy theme on the history lessons. Okay, so until next time, in solidarity. Bye.